All right. So thank you very much to the West Bengal Political Science Association and the ICCR, etc., for this, this invitation to come and talk to you about India and its neighbors. What I'm presenting to you today is actually a research project on which I'm working. So this is very much a work in progress, and this is probably the ideas are probably at a stage when I wouldn't call them absolutely refined. This is basically a bit of a first draft of ideas, but I will present it here today, and if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So all of you know that when Mr. Modi became Prime Minister of India for the first time in 2014, he went to great lengths to invite the heads of all the neighboring SAARC nations to come to his swearing-in ceremony. And during that time, Mr. Modi talked about a new start with India's neighbors, that India would now, under a BJP government, have a new relationship with India's neighbors. He talked about India's focus on India's own national development being very closely tied with the development of India's neighboring countries. And basically, he rolled the red carpet out and said India is going to follow what came to be known as the neighborhood first policy. So this started in 2014, this whole neighborhood first policy, India rolling out the red carpet, India inviting the heads of government of every neighboring country to Mr. Modi's swearing in, and Mr. Modi going to great lengths to say that India's development trajectory, India's path towards great power status will not be done in isolation. India's fate is very closely tied to the fate and aspirations of neighboring countries. Now, if you look back over the last 12 years that Mr. Modi has been in power, this is now Mr. Modi's third term in office. The story in the last 12 years, particularly with India's neighbors, has not been very positive. In fact, some might say that the neighborhood first policy has floundered, particularly from Mr. Modi's second term onwards and into his third term. And many scholars, myself included, we have questioned, what is the rationale, what is the purpose of taking such a very tolerant, a very cooperative approach to India's neighbors when developments in India's neighboring countries can be interpreted as being basically anti-India or hostile to India. Now, this then leads to two big research questions. The first question is, why do India's neighbors, immediate neighbors, why do they distrust India so much? Or some might even say, why do they hate India so much? And this is a question that is very important, but this is not for discussion today. We can discuss this some other time. Why is it that India's neighbors have such a dim view of India, such a hostility towards India? Some might say even hatred towards India. So I'm not getting into that today. The second question is what I'm getting into, and this question is that what was inherently wrong, or what was inherently the problem with India's neighborhood first policy? In other words, why did this policy fail to create cordial relations between India and its immediate neighbors under the Modi regime? So Modi has been in power for 12 years. BJP, NDA has been in power for 12 years. They had emphasized a lot about building cooperative ties with, particularly with immediate neighboring countries. It hasn't happened that way. So the question is, why hasn't it happened that way? Why has this policy floundered in that sense. Now, to answer this question, I use two different theoretical approaches, and these theoretical approaches will take some little time to flesh out. The first approach is to understand, particularly under Mr. Modi, but even going back before Mr. Modi, what I call the India way of international relations. So, in international relations, states adopt a certain posture, they see international relations in a certain way. India is no exception. So, you could say, there is a Western way of international relations, there is a Chinese way of international relations. Similarly, what is the India way of international relations? And this affects India's conduct of not only international politics, but also foreign policy, which is the instrument through which India interacts with the world. So, this India way, to understand it, I would say it is based on four foundational pillars. So, there are four parts to this India way. The first part is that in this worldview, this India way worldview, India sees the world as one community, and the defining feature of international relations in this concept of a global community is humanity. That we approach international relations with a very human perspective. International relations must be for the entire global community. Whatever we do must benefit the entire global community. So this is, typically a lot of people talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, India's approach to international relations, saying the world is one. We are all different, but we are all part of one community. Number two, in this model of international relations, there is no dominance of one over, on and dependence on the other side. So this dominance dependence, one is powerful, the other is basically dependent and subjugated. This kind of power politics or power balance is often rejected. And India therefore argues, and Mr. Modi, Mr. Jaishankar, many other players have often talked about this, that every actor in international relations must be treated with dignity, must be treated with respect, and of course with equality. So India sees international relations not as naked power politics of dominance dependence, one is more powerful, the other is less powerful, but it is about actors who are treated with equality, with respect, and certainly with dignity. And even at the G7, the recently concluded G7, if you followed Mr. Modi's pronouncements when he was there in France, he was actually referring to some of this, that that every actor must be treated with dignity, respect, and equality. Thirdly, India argues that India is actually not in favor of a naked, aggressive kind of hard power politics. In other words, the use of military power or hard power to pursue international objectives is something that India is not comfortable with. And India obviously doesn't rule out the use of hard power, but probably sees the role of hard power almost as a matter of last resort. That after you have tried diplomacy, after you have tried everything, if ultimately you have to use hard power, then it has to be a question of last resort. And even then, when you are talking about hard power use as a last resort, India is more comfortable if you say that this must be done with proper international authorization. In other words, follow the UN Charter. The UN Charter is very categorical. There are certain exceptional circumstances when aggressive hard power can be used. If you do that, then perhaps it's okay as a matter of last resort. But the naked use of hard power to go after policy objectives is not something that the India way is in favor of. And finally, the fourth pillar of this India Way policy is that global institutions, international law, international norms, this must be given the highest priority, particularly by big powers or great powers. That when it comes to small states, they basically obey international law and norms pretty much most of the time. It is the big powers, the great powers, who often violate it. India is not very happy with that. So India's way of doing international relations is that these global institutions, international law, international norms must be respected, particularly by the great powers. But this also requires that international institutions must become truly democratic, it must become truly global, and therefore international institutions must, at the end of the day, reflect the will of the international community in the truest sense. So India's position on UN reforms, for example, that why should the UN Security Council be reformed, is coming from this kind of an idea that the UN Security Council does not represent an overwhelming majority of the global population, because only 5 countries are permanent members, the rest are not, and therefore this needs to be reformed because it is anachronistic. Now, this has, by and large, I would argue, guided India's foreign policy thinking, particularly under Mr. Modi. And the net effect of this, I argue, is that India has adopted, when it comes to the immediate neighborhood, 3 very distinctive style of operation in dealing with India's neighbors. Number 1, some might call this Kenneth Waltz's classic defensive realism. What I would say is that what it comes down to is that India is a growing power. India aspires, great power status. India's power is obviously increasing, but India's posture in international politics is essentially defensive as opposed to offensive. So India's argument has always been, we have to have power, we have to protect ourselves, but essentially we are happy with what we have. We don't covet anybody's territory. We don't want to flex our muscle even in the neighborhood. Forget about the wider international or wider global community. And many critics have said that this kind of a defensive posture, this is why I use Kenneth Waltz's defensive realism. India is realistic, but it's defensive realism. This has made India a reactive power rather than a proactive power. So India reacts to situations, India reacts to development rather than proactively looking for optimal outcomes. And I'll give you an example of this. Several years ago, Stephen Cohen, the late Stephen Cohen, who had studied South Asia, India, Pakistan in some depth, one of the leading American voices, he wrote a book with Das Gupta, and they titled this book, quote unquote, "Arming Without Aiming." So basically, argument was that India is arming itself. India is becoming a massive military power, but this power, this newfound military power or hard power, is not aimed at particular countries or particular regions, or India is not using it in a very proactive, offensive way to go and seek out certain outcomes that this military power would allow India to do. And India is therefore sitting back in a defensive posture. It reacts to situations rather than proactively looking to change situations, change development. And some of you may have even heard India's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval. There are YouTube videos. You can hear Ajit Doval talking about this. That, the only difference Ajit Doval makes is when it comes to terrorism, when he says under Mr. Modi, we have decided that sometimes we need to play offensive defense. So, in other words, we like to defend. We are defensive, but sometimes we do offensive things because it enhances the defensive position. So, for example, going and hitting terrorist camps inside Pakistan might be an example of offensive defense in terms of Mr. Doval's outlook. So sometimes we are doing that, but we are generally more comfortable playing defense, being reactive, but we are also mindful that we need power, so therefore our military strength is also growing. So this is one net effect. Second effect is, very strangely, and this is where scholars like me have a problem with India's neighborhood first policy particularly. There seems to me, at least to me, that India is rejecting, or at least not very seriously enforcing, what I call a sphere of influence type of posture. In other words, you could look at international relations in many different ways. So one way of looking at it would be to say, for example, that after the end of the Cold War, at least the initial 20-year period or 25-year period, people talked about unipolar hegemony of the United States. India clearly is opposed to that. India is basically saying, we don't like this unipolar hegemonic type of model. Jaishankar himself has often talked about this international order now changing from unipolar hegemony to now multipolar world, multiple great powers, multiple areas or multiple great powers scattered across the globe. But India often rejects in this discussion that when you become a great power, so if India is one of, let's say, the great powers that are emerging, is there a very specific area that is under India's domination, which that India might consider, this is my sphere of influence. By contrast, when America carried out this Venezuela operation, when they went and captured Maduro, you may have heard after that operation, even somebody as high up as Secretary of State Marco Rubio talking about the Western Hemisphere being under America's sphere of influence. So many American scholars, for example, started talking about, Trump is announcing a new Monroe Doctrine, that we will not allow any peer competitor in the sphere of influence. The Chinese may not buy Venezuelan oil. We will nationalize the Panama Canal. We would, prevent Chinese business interest in Latin America, etc., etc. In other words, America basically saying the Western Hemisphere is off limits for other great powers. America will not tolerate any peer competitor in this area. This is my sphere of influence. And in some senses, the Russians are saying the same thing, in terms of the Ukraine war, that the expansion of NATO, the expansion of European Union, this has come as far as it would be allowed to come. In my sphere of influence, which includes the immediate countries that borders Russia, they may not enter. And if you try to enter, this is Russia's red line. If you try to cross the red line, there will be blowback effect. There will be war. And the Chinese are saying the same thing when it comes to East Asia, Northeast Asia, even the South China Sea, saying this is my sphere of influence. And if you ask the Chinese scholars, the Chinese politicians, they made no bones of the fact that China's basic strategic objective is to push the American presence out of the first island chains and then out of the second island chains. So every great power, America, Russia, China, they talk in terms of sphere of influence. My take is that Indians are very reluctant to talk about South Asia as being under an Indian sphere of influence. They talk about multipolarity, they talk about rejection of unipolar hegemony and so on and so forth, but they don't want to go the full distance and say we are a great power. South Asia, maybe even the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal is my domain, and I will not tolerate peer competition in this particular area. India hasn't done that, not in a very forceful way. And thirdly, India, you might actually argue that under Mr. Modi, even though India has developed at a rapid pace, Indian military is now considered the fourth largest in the world or the fourth most powerful in the world, so on and so forth. But India's basic approach when it comes to other great powers, whether it's America, Russia, China, etc., this approach is not so much dependent on balancing against hard power. So, if the Chinese have a net power quotient, the Americans have a net power quotient, India is not aspiring to reach that level very quickly so that there is a hard balancing of power between India and other great powers. Instead, my view is that India is more interested in balancing threats. So, not balancing power, but balancing threats. And India prefers soft balancing as opposed to hard balancing. So, soft balancing is more India style, and soft balancing means balancing with economic interest, cultural interest, anything other than hardcore military power. And this is probably the preference. India prefers the more diplomatic way of resolving disputes, diplomatic way of dealing with problems and crises, etc. So very typical of soft balancing compared to hard balancing, almost saying that we are very reluctant when it comes to actually using hard power or even threatening the use of hard power. So before you use even hard power, you have to threaten the use of hard power. India almost seems very reluctant to do that, and as a result, many scholars often argue that India is more interested in soft balancing, more interested in balancing threats rather than balancing the power quotient of its main peer competitors. Now, having said that, let me come to my core hypothesis on why the neighborhood first policy has floundered. So you've understood the India way, that this is the India way, this is the net effect of that. So what's my take on this? Why do I think the neighborhood first policy has failed to deliver the kind of results that Mr. Modi had expected? My take is, or my core hypothesis is, that India's neighborhood first policy has floundered mainly because of the way India has approached international relations. So this India way is probably one big reason why this policy has floundered. In other words, I argue that India is becoming a great power, no doubt about it. We are becoming a great power, but India refuses to act like a great power, particularly when it comes to the neighborhood. So you may ask the question, what is it that great powers do? How do great powers act? What is the great power way of conducting international relations? Now, to understand this essence of great powerhood and how great powers should behave, the answer comes not from defensive realists like Kenneth Walsh, but offensive realists like John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, and so on. So what is the basic crux of the argument of the offensive realists? The offensive realists basically argue that when you become a great power, as India is becoming a great power or probably has become a great power, you must develop an offensive mindset, whether you like it or not. So you have no choice. You have to develop an offensive mindset when you become a great power, whether you like it or not. And the question then becomes, why? What is the logic? Why would great powers behave with that offensive, preemptive, proactive kind of way? The simple answer to this question is that when you become a great power, you automatically enter into an intensely competitive game for influence and dominance with other great powers. There is no choice here. This is what comes with great powerhood. So when you become a great power, you automatically enter into this intensely competitive game with other great powers for influence and dominance. And in this competitive game, a great power has to be particularly sensitive to its neighborhood, because this is the great power's immediate area. Whether you like it or not, this is what offensive realism teaches us about great powers and how they should behave with their immediate neighborhood. Now, there are 5 main arguments why this ought to be the case. Why should great powers like India ought to be more offensive minded, more proactive, more preemptive, preempt problems, particularly in the neighborhood. So, in other words, in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal, India's immediate neighborhood. Why should India be like that, looked at from the lens of offensive realism? So I'll give you the 5 examples, and I'll talk about how India has not, as a great power, how the India way has prevented India from acting like this. So number 1, great powers, and this applies to all states in some degrees, but great powers have tremendous capability of this, that great powers have the tremendous capability or capacity to cause pain, because they are big military powers. If they want, they can cause a lot of pain. And this pain can be caused very easily to neighboring smaller states if great powers choose to do so. So smaller states must understand that a great power like India can actually cause a lot of pain if it wants to, if it chooses to. Now, for the most part, great powers may not choose to inflict this pain. That's okay. A great power may say, I'm not going to use kinetic force. I'm not going to use coercive force. I'm not going to try that. I may adopt a cooperative approach to my smaller neighbors. I can do that. There's no problem with that. Maybe that's the way the great power wants to go. But this is important, that if a great power is pushed into a corner, particularly if situations develop in a neighborhood which is interpreted by the great power as now posing serious threats to national security. So pushed into a corner meaning a serious problem in terms of national security, great powers must be prepared to inflict pain. So this is number 1 from offensive realism, that are you willing, are you able to inflict pain? Now my argument is, when it comes to the neighborhood, if I put it to an empirical test, this first point, India is very, very reluctant to inflict serious pain. Now you may come back and say, look, India did Operation Sindoor. Yes, but then India was very eager to end this war after 4 days, as soon as Pakistan said, we have had enough. We don't want to fight anymore. And we can debate, whether America played any role, who said what. But the point is, and India has said this, Jaishankar Modi have said this, and others have said this, that as soon as Pakistan got in touch with India and said, we have had enough, we don't want to escalate anymore, India said, okay, that's it, So very limited aim. We wanted to bomb the terrorist camps. We did that. They escalated on day 2 and day 3. We responded by hitting their 11 military bases, air bases, and the Pakistanis had enough, and they said, let's stop. And we said, okay, let's stop. Some of us, myself included, I actually expected some ground operations of India across the line of control in Kashmir. I thought, that this was a war that a very offensive-minded great power would take advantage of, at least if not anything else, to occupy and reclaim the Pakistani part of Kashmir. There was a perfect opportunity. India didn't do that. Even though India says that the Pakistani part of Kashmir is technically India's territory, when the opportunity came, We didn't take it. India didn't take it. So India didn't act like a great power on that first point. Second point is, great powers do not like being told what they may or may not do, particularly by neighboring small states. So neighboring small states, if they come and tell great powers, I don't care whether you like it or not, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, right? What do you think would be the reaction of a normal great power? I mean, imagine, take the Ukraine-Russia example. The Ukrainians knew very well that there is a government in Kiev that was pro-Russian. This government, with the help of CIA operatives, was kicked out of power, the Maidan coup of 2014. Russia reacted by going and taking the Crimea after the 2014 Maidan coup. So the regime that came to power with the help of the CIA essentially consisted of neo-Nazis. This is now pretty open, open secret that these guys are neo-Nazis. Today, even Poland has finally drawn the red line and said, I don't like Zelensky praising Nazi collaborators who massacred Polish people during the Second World War. So everybody knew that from 2014 onwards that these were neo-Nazis. And what did they start doing? They started bombarding the Donbass, because the Donbass area, the people are ethnically Russian. They speak Russian language. And when they were targeted, they obviously appealed to Moscow saying, if you don't help us, then we are doomed. We are all going to die. And Ukraine government started saying that we are going to join the European Union and NATO. And Ukraine knew very well that from 2008 onwards, 2007, 2008, Russia had led the red line saying countries like Ukraine, Georgia, etc. cannot join NATO. This is Russia's red line. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, famously said to Tony Blinken, the American Secretary of State under Biden, what is it about Niet that you guys did not understand? This is we had laid down the rules. We had said this is not going to happen. We'll not tolerate this. So great powers don't like being told what they may or may not do, particularly by neighboring smaller countries. Now, what this means is that there is a red line, there is a limit to what a great power will tolerate, how much patience will it demonstrate. A great power may still want to resolve a bilateral problem peacefully. It may want to accommodate some demands of the smaller side. But if you push a great power too far, so in the Ukrainian case, when you poke the Russian bear in the eye time and time again, and very deliberately and very provocatively, you get the reaction that the Russians gave to Ukraine. And this is a hallmark of a great power. So imagine if Mexico did that to the United States, US Marines would be in Mexico. They would be doing exactly to Mexico what the Russians have done to Ukraine. And similarly, the Chinese, President Trump was in Beijing a few weeks ago. And in his summit meeting with Xi, I can tell you that one of the things that Xi actually said to Trump in absolute brutal, honest fashion, no misunderstanding. He basically put down the red line over Taiwan. He said if there is any attempt by America to push Taiwan towards independence, meaning encouraging Taiwan to declare independence, China will invade. This will mean war. This is our red line. You got to understand that. Don't do it. Obviously, everybody is now waiting and watching whether Donald Trump will authorize $14 billion of arms sales to Taiwan. I don't know. Trump, after he came back from China, he basically said that Taiwan is 9,000 kilometers from the west coast of the United States. It'll be very hard to defend Taiwan, etc., which has sent shockwaves through Asia. I can tell you that. I live in Perth, Australia. I study Asia. So in every Asian country, particularly in South Korea, in Japan, in Philippines, in Taiwan, in Vietnam, etc., people are questioning whether America could be trusted to defend them in the event of a Chinese aggressive move. And this whole question of, is Trump credible? Is America's commitment credible? Is America a trustworthy partner? So this is something that is happening in Asia, and people are also beginning to question. I mean, some of these countries, as you probably know, are under America's existential deterrence. Means American nuclear umbrella covers many of these countries. Question about whether that can be depended also is now very much up in the air. And things may happen in the next few years in terms of countries like Japan, South Korea having serious debate about whether they should develop their own nuclear deterrent. So great powers do not like being told what they can and cannot do, particularly by smaller states, etc. Now, take this also as an example in India's case. India tolerates nonsense from communist Nepal. When Oli was prime minister, he brought up this border issue. He started publishing maps showing areas, which India controls as part of Nepal. He started producing, government documents questioning this, probably at the instigation of the Chinese, trying to rile India. And what was India's reaction? Nothing, docile. This is settled border. If there is any issue, that will be discussed diplomatically and bilaterally. India also got pushed out of Bangladesh. As those of you in Calcutta, that the regime change operation against Sheikh Hasina was done by the American deep state. Absolutely clear. America wanted to access the Indian Northeast. America wanted access to Myanmar, etc. America's whole focus is not Bangladesh. They couldn't give a toss about Bangladesh. What happens to Bangladesh? I mean, they were more interested in destabilizing Myanmar. And American game plan is to create a northern Shan state in Myanmar. So engineering a breakup of Myanmar, as America has done in Europe, in many countries, as you know, that we will create a Shan state in northern Myanmar, which borders China. And it is from this base in northern Myanmar, we will try and destabilize China. So this whole game is about China, fighting China. And to fight China, we need to have access to the Chinese border through Myanmar. Now, the problem between America and India happened because Modi refused to give this access to the United States because Modi didn't want to get caught in the squabble between US and China. So Modi played neutral. He said, look, you cannot have this here in India. So therefore, America's attention went to Bangladesh. Modi tried to save Sheikh Hasina government by saying, there's an election coming, don't destabilize the government. America did not listen, and this is what we have. So who's in power in Bangladesh? Tariq Rahman, who everybody knows was a member of, or probably is still a member of, the Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a banned organization in Britain. So you have brought, one of the most ferocious Islamist fundamentalists into power in Bangladesh, because Tariq Rahman would give America access to St. Martin's Islands and so on and so forth. So from Bangladesh, we can do operation in Myanmar. And of course, there is now also the other thing which is now coming out, because you may remember that one American and several Ukrainians got arrested in Calcutta airport. And these guys were actually heading to Mizoram and to the India-Myanmar border, from where they were actually training the Myanmarese militia, the various ethnic militias, in terms of drone warfare. So these are drone warfare specialists who were infiltrating into Myanmar from Indian Northeast to teach them about this. So this was also the problem that India India get out-muscled from these areas, from Bangladesh, from Nepal, even Mohammad Muzu, when he came to power in Maldives. I mean, look at his tone. I mean, the anti-India tone that he adopted. Some of his ministers adopted. Were basically giving a lecture to India, saying, don't even look here. We are with the Chinese. The Chinese will come and help us. And India's reaction was, again, Modi went to Lakshadweep and he sat there and he tried to prove a point by saying, we will develop Lakshadweep. So this is the second point. Thirdly, very quickly, great powers are incredibly sensitive about their immediate neighborhood and about their spheres of influence. This is considered vital for national security. Excuse me. And in that sphere of influence, great powers do not tolerate disobedience, or they don't tolerate developments that they consider as undermining their national security and national well-being. Classic example, America's reaction in Venezuela, that we can't get Maduro to do what we want him to do, so therefore we are going to take Maduro out, put the next people in who will listen to us. But the bottom line is Venezuelan oil cannot go to China. And they might do the same thing in Cuba, but probably Cuba is not as strategically important. It is more emotionally important, maybe not so strategically important, because the Chinese or Russia is not heavily into Cuba. But South America would be. I mean, some of these mining contracts that the Chinese have with Chile, with Argentina, with Brazil, these are definitely under the scanner, and America would probably take strong action to prevent China from obtaining a lot of material from South America, if America were to decide that this is the way we are going to go. So in other words, this is our sphere of influence, and we call the shots. We decide what's good for us, and we don't tolerate peer competitors. And smaller neighbors who are in touch with peer competitors will be in the crosshairs. But India also did not do that. India was very tolerant of the Rajapaksa regime in Sri Lanka when the Rajapaksas tilted totally towards China. India's position, I don't know whether now under Tariq Rahman the Chinese would come and build up the Teesta Basin, as some reports are saying. India didn't react when Muhammad Yunus went to Beijing and he talked about severing the Indian Northeast from India. He said, we are going to build a greater Bangladesh. And he said it publicly. He was the head of the caretaker government, and he said it publicly. And what was New Delhi's reaction? Officially, nothing. Covertly, I don't know what India is doing, but at least officially, as a signal to the neighborhood, nothing again. Fourthly, and this is very important, offensive realists say that great powers absolutely do not tolerate peer competitors. So the ideal position for a great power is global hegemony that America has exercised in the 20-25 years after the Cold War. But now that is changing. So now other countries are coming up. You are entering now into a multipolar international order. But in this international order, this multipolar order, great powers, the reason why they cannot cooperate is because they cannot trust the real intention of other great powers. So Kenneth Walsh, when he actually wrote his theory of international politics, he had argued that great powers should come to the logical conclusion that instead of trying to increase your power against other competitors, it's better to work out how much power you need to defend yourself, and you hold on to that and you maintain that balance of power. But that logic only works if every great power were to make that decision, that we are not going to pursue anything more. We have what we have, we will defend it, everybody lives happily. But that's not the way the world works. The reason it doesn't work, according to the offensive realist, is that you can never judge the intention of another great power. So can Donald Trump basically say what Xi Jinping is thinking? Or can Xi Jinping say what Donald Trump might do, or what he's thinking, or what Putin is thinking, or what Modi is thinking? No. So when you can't predict what these people are thinking, what they might do, and not just do tomorrow, but 5 years down the line, what they might do. There could be a new regime, new leader. How is that leader going to behave? I don't know. So when you don't know something, it is always logically safer to fall back on a worst case scenario analysis. So logically, from the point of view of offensive realism, great powers always operate on worst case scenario analysis, and they always prefer preemptive operation than reactive operation. So you try to preempt situations. You try to get control of situations rather than letting things fester and letting things develop and then reacting to something which has become really, really problematic. So my interpretation would be, and I could be challenged on this by many people, and I see Amira sitting here in the audience, but my feeling is that this is exactly how Benjamin Netanyahu is thinking. That can I really trust Hezbollah? Can I trust Hamas? Can I trust the Houthis? Can I trust the Palestinian Authority? Can I trust the Iranians? Can I trust even the Turkish people, the Turks? And he's probably come to the conclusion that no, after October 7, I cannot trust any of them. So any agreement, even if they say, we are happy to negotiate with you and we are happy to accept your terms, etc. How do I know that in 2 years' time or 5 years' time that they would not renege on the deal? So he is trying to do what the Sri Lankans did to the Tamil Tigers, which is this has to be finished completely so that, it is almost like operating on a cancer patient and saying, let's do a surgery and take the entire cancer out, and maybe that will give you 10 years, 15 years, 20 years lease of life. It's a very difficult policy to morally justify, maybe normatively justify in terms of international law. But my point, my job as an analyst is not to give value judgment, but to try and explain what might be in the minds of leaders. So somebody like Netanyahu probably is thinking along those lines. So my point is that because you cannot predict what others are going to do, particularly other competitors, great powers should also have a very short patience threshold when it comes to inimical developments in the neighborhood. Again, on this question, I think India's behavior does not reflect the behavior of a great power. India is basically sitting back, letting things develop, and once it becomes a big problem, then it's trying to react. This is not really, behavior of a great power. And lastly, and this is the danger sign for smaller countries in South Asia, that if these smaller countries have this view that because India is a reluctant power, reluctant to wield the axe, reluctant to use hard power, India way, as I talked about, talks about cooperation, humanity, etc., etc. A more friendly approach to international relations based on this idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, etc., etc. That if this emboldens them, if they come to believe that we can balance India by bringing other big powers into our national territories. So whether it's Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Pakistan or whoever it is, or Nepal, this is a very dangerous mindset. Because when you do that, what eventually will happen, as the Ukraine war has shown, is that outsiders seldom come and shed blood to defend you. So when your local great power will eventually wake up and get upset and do things to hurt you, outsiders won't come and defend you. The Chinese will not send the PLA to defend the Sinhalese. The Chinese will not send the PLA to defend the Bangladeshis or defend the Nepalese, or the Americans would not come and put enormous pressure on India because India is taking action against Bangladesh or against Nepal or against Pakistan. In fact, Donald Trump said in France, in front of Modi, that if India is attacked, we will come and help India as long as Modi is prime minister. And he said, tongue in cheek, that I don't know whether we will do that if somebody else were the prime minister, but as long as Modi is the prime minister, America will come and defend India. We will do whatever it takes to help India. So, knowing that, I think South Asia's smaller neighbors are probably, this anti-India hostility that I see, coming, sometimes coming from Nepal, coming from Sri Lanka, certainly from Pakistan. This is an extremely dangerous thing for them, because eventually, at some point, India will wake up and India's reaction will not be so kind. And that's when, things will probably deteriorate. And I'll finish with one last thing, and then if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer it. What I would say is that for great powers like Russia, like America, like China, like India, it is very important when it comes to the neighborhood not to concede or not to, allow neighboring territories to be misused, to be used or misused or manipulated against the great power. So there is a territory called Bangladesh, there's a territory called Nepal, there's a territory called Maldives, there's a territory called Sri Lanka, certainly Pakistan. These are small territories compared to India. India is a giant, India is a huge country. But being a giant, if you allow these smaller territories to be used against you, so in other words, if India doesn't have total control over these territories in some way, then these territories could be misused. Domestic politics in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Pakistan could influence developments, that these developments would then be used against India. This is eventually going to be problematic for India. So India will have to think very seriously about not allowing these territories to be used against India. Now, how do you do that? That's the big question. How do you prevent these territories from working against you? Many things can be done. Many things can be done. And one of my suggestions in this book, and I will talk about this probably in the Q&A if you ask me, is that I would like to see that India actually now making the case that Nepal, certainly Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, should enter into some kind of confederal arrangement with India. That maybe a confederation could be set up where India becomes a protector of Nepal. Nepal becomes a protectorate of India. Bhutan becomes a protectorate of India. Maldives, Sri Lanka becomes a protectorate of India. And the terms of a confederal arrangement can be discussed, debated. International law does allow it. Bangladesh, Pakistan would be slightly different because of the way Bangladesh and Pakistan were created, after 47. But when it comes to Bangladesh, I will personally not be surprised if I find that India has, forcibly occupied the Rangpur area of Bangladesh, which widens the Siliguri corridor, or India has taken control of the Chittagong hill tracts, which prevents, the Pakistani ISI from infiltrating weapons and other materials into the Indian Northeast. So Indian national security may require India to take a much more harder look at Bangladesh, much more harder look at Pakistan, certainly a much more harder look at Nepal and Bhutan, because these are, the two states. So let me end there, and if you have questions, happy to answer them.
Yeah, वो मेरा friend Rajat Gupta, international conference holder, excellent speaker.